So something, as you're talking about this transition going from 20th century Marxism, imagining this 21st century Marxism.
I would put 21st century socialism.
Or socialism, sorry,
yeah.
From a Marxist perspective.
Yeah.
Something that I didn't hear addressed in the presentation, but I know you have done work on, is thinking about maybe something that's represented in that middle photograph there, which is critique that has been leveled constantly at Marxist organizations, coming from like Eurocentric ways of knowing the world, ways of understanding society, ways of understanding roles.
Yeah.
So protests on behalf of people of color, particularly women of color.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, I raised this also because, you know, where Antonio Daber started this conference off this morning, it's making me think a lot about these things right now too. So even within Marxism, right, some of those critiques and some of those objections, right, how do you navigate that and still maintain a Marxist perspective?
Well, I think, you know, I would repeat what I said earlier about, to quote Jean-Paul Sartre, saying, you know, Marxism is a living philosophy. And I think the Soviet model failed. It failed. And it failed, I think it's inconceivable now. when I was like, saying when I was, I don't know, in my 20s or early, I don't know, but I would hear socialists stand up and talk about the rights of the working man. You know? Nobody would flinch. Oh yes, I believe in the rights of the working man. And if you read stuff written before, I don't know when, but if you read stuff written in the past, you know, it's all about working men, and it meant that. It meant working men. It meant mainly white working men. You know? It meant white working men from the north. Well, that's inconceivable now. I don't think we could conceivably run a socialist world without considering these other equality issues. And if you read, again, you know, I read regularly Socialist Worker, which is the newspaper of the Socialist Workers' Party. They are very keen on all these other issues. You know, it's not. You know, 21st century socialism is not just based on class anymore. Marxists still see that class defines capitalism, and you know, capitalism could conceivably exist with equality for women, equality conceivably. It's very unlikely for people of colour, for disabled people, for LGBT communities, without ageism. It could conceivably exist with all this, but it couldn't exist. It still rely on the appropriation of surplus value. You cannot have a class in a society and capitalism. It's impossible because capitalism can only exist on the appropriation of surplus value, and that's why I've been misquoted a lot, particularly by some critical race theorists like David Gilbourne in the UK. He's a good friend of mine, by the way. David Gilbourne in the UK said, "Oh, you're a Marxist. All you think about is class." You know, I've actually been writing about racism, for example, you know, since I started writing, but from a Marxist perspective. So I think, yes, I think it's inconceivable that we will never return to, I'm a Marxist, I believe in the rights of the working man. No.
Well, I mean, like in that photograph, right?
The middle one.
Yes, the deification of representing the movement are male figures.
Yes, that's
where there are many other ways of knowing
absolutely
things. Yet we Marxists really heavily, you know, and I find myself implicated in this many times, heavily relying on those folks.
Yeah, and it's interesting that a woman of colour should choose to buy a T-shirt with 4 men. But you know, like all societies, Venezuela is a patriarchal society. That's, you know, that's not a get out. You know, the world is, you know, and I've always, you know, although I've written primarily about Marxism, I've always been aware of patriarchy as a very, very powerful defining force, just as critical race theory tells me about the centrality of racism. But I retain a belief in Marxism, but informed by other identities other than class. And a future socialist society must be equal for all.